lectures because I did not have a any kind of pre-recorded lectures for them. So I am adding the lectures as I complete them to the lecture thing, and I'll continue to do that for the next 3 lectures. So if you missed something, you can go back and look at the lectures. Also, remember, we have a midterm Tuesday. I've posted the review guide. You can click through to it and look at, these are the things I think are important, so they're the things you want to focus on for the exam. Also, make sure that you realize there's a homework assignment due tonight, and there's no late submission. So get whatever you have, get it in by tomorrow at 6 a.m. And I will have solutions posted tomorrow so that you have them available over the weekend to study for the exam. Yes.
So on the Q1, you said something about making sure that you always call close on your like line tokenizer.
Yeah, you can use a try with resources too if you want.
Well, I guess. And then in like the grading thing, you said something about it being in a finally clause, but mine's not, and it's still always.
Are you using a try with resources? Do you know what a try with resources is? If we go back to, let's see, I think it was scanners. So let's see if I can find the, probably would be, no, it'd be IO. Let's see. No, it's not showing up, so let's do a try with resources. So if you do a try statement and before you have the curly braces, you have in commas, not commas, in parentheses, some allocation of resources, those will be automatically closed for you no matter what. So that's called a try with resources statement. So that will automatically close it. But otherwise, the only way to close it is with a finally statement, because if you have a, say you have a try, and where do you have your scans? Where do you?
I opened the scanner before the try block.
Okay. So you open the scanner here.
And then I try to in-queue, and then I catch the potential.
So you do a catch.
And then I try to DQ, and I catch the potential underflow. And then after all that, then I close the scanner.
Okay. So it would probably work as long as you're not rethrowing anything, as long as you're catching everything. If you have a rethrow, or if you don't catch everything that you're throwing here, then it's possible this close statement won't get executed. So I would have to go back and look more carefully to see whether you're supposed to be throwing anything out of there. If you're supposed to be throwing anything out of there, then I know your close statement doesn't always get executed. But if you're catching everything, then it's fine to put the close there. It's just really better to use a finally statement, because if someone's maintaining your code down the road, they may add a uncatchable thing, and then your close statement would no longer close the resource. So it's just good form to get in that habit.
I had 2 different try-catch blocks.
Mm-hmm.
Why I didn't do that? Since, well, I guess I could have done that differently. But,
it's just, right, I guess the thing is, you just, however you write it, you want to guarantee that the scanner gets closed no matter what, once it can no longer be used. As long as you follow that principle, you're okay. it's just the best way to ensure it is with a try with resources or a finally statement, because those definitely guarantee it. Okay, but as long as you've guaranteed it, you're okay. But if there's a loophole, that's not good. Okay. Other questions? Okay. So today we're going to finish up with information, kind of my introduction to information management, and then we're going to go through a fairly whirlwind discussion of HTML, because I'm not trying to get in depth here. I just want you to have a general understanding of what HTML is, what it looks like, what cascading style sheets are, basic idea of how to use them. Okay, it's pretty important. Obviously, the World Wide Web is probably the most widely used information resource these days. Therefore, it really is important you understand how web pages are being created and formatted. But first, we'll finish up with information management, and we have covered how you capture content, how you manage and store content. I went pretty quickly through analysis and navigation, and today we want to finish up with how you present content. So I'll skip, they always say don't bury the headline, so I'll actually skip to the most salient points first. So the most salient points are that we get the majority of our sensory input through the human eye. It's an order of magnitude greater than the ear. That's an order of magnitude greater than either the skin or the nose. So when we present information via computer, it's almost always visual in nature. And that's what we will focus on in this course, is visual output. So that's the headline number one. Then the way we present things, if you have primarily textual information, tables are a good way to present textual information. They organize it well into rows and columns. Spreadsheets do that. Relational databases present their output as tables. Hypertext is another way. Essentially, a web page is a good way to present text. If you have more graphical information, then graphs and plots are good for numerical data. Animations are good for dynamic systems, and diagrams and figures are good for more static relationships. So that's essentially your big headline kind of stuff. Okay, that's your general rules. And there's just literally hundreds of ways to do graphs, to do diagrams. There's books devoted to how you present information. We just don't have time for all of that. So I decided the one topic I would talk about in some detail was at a more basic research level, properties of the human visual system, because when you're presenting information, these are the things you need to keep in mind about the human visual system. So if you're using animation or video, you need 20 to 30 frames per second to gain the illusion of continuous motion. So that's the frame rate you need to trick the human eye into thinking that it's continuous motion. But if what you're doing is simply dragging things around the display, you can drop down to about 5 frames per second, meaning that's how many updates you would do per second. And the human eye will be forgiving as you're moving and think of it as being continuous. Okay? So some other things, I'll let you read it. I'm not going to go over everything. But the next big issue is color sensitivity. So there is a little basic thing about the human eye. You have two things that are able to record light. One are rods and one are cones. They perform two different functions. So rods are able to respond to intensity. i.e. brightness, but they are color agnostic. Okay, so rods, essentially black and white, but they're able to register the brightness of something. The cones are what respond to color, but they're not nearly as sensitive to the intensity of the light, the brightness. Okay, rods are about 100 times both more sensitive and are 20 times more numerous than cones, which unsurprisingly means that we perceive differences in brightness much better than differences in color. So while you may think that it's really jazzy to use colors to do things, in fact, the biggest thing you want to do is contrasting intensities. Basically, you want to juxtapose darks and lights because brightness is much more important than color. We're 10 times more sensitive to variations in brightness than we are to variations in color. So you want to use contrasting intensities of colors. Okay? And if you're curious about how many shades we can distinguish, basically, depending on whom you read, we can distinguish anywhere from about 64 to 128 different shades of a color. And our ocular system does a little processing, which makes it able to sense somewhat more shades. Generally, it's accepted that about 256 shades of a color is the most the human eye can distinguish, which is why giving 8 bits per color is adequate. That's the scientific basis for the RGB 3-byte model. Okay? It also means that you should be skeptical when you buy a TV set about claims that 4D TV or OLED TV is going to dramatically increase your viewing experience. Okay? The resolutions have already gotten essentially to the limit of the human perceptual ability to determine distances. So at this point, all these great new technologies in TVs are extracting more money from your wallet. It's not clear that you actually are gaining anything from the screen. Okay, so just be aware there is a limit to your ability to distinguish color. Okay. So also, we're much less capable of distinguishing intensity at the edges of the spectrum. So if you remember, I don't know how many of you, I'm just curious, how many of you have seen Roy G. Biv? Raise your hands if you have. Okay, it's the colors of the rainbow. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Okay, so red and oranges and blues are at the edges of the spectrum, and yellows and greens are at the middle. So you're less able to distinguish between reds and oranges and between indigo and violet than you are between yellows and greens. So when you are using colors, it is better to use sharply contrasting reds, sharply contrasting violets, whereas yellows and greens, the human eye is a little bit better able to distinguish shades of those. Okay, so that's another thing to keep in mind. Third thing to keep in mind, about 1% of the population is colorblind to one or more of the primary colors. Does anyone know what is the primary color that people are colorblind to? Red. So in general, so they can still see it as a gray color, or I forget how but I think it's more as a gray. They just can't view it as red. Okay? So you have to be careful about using red in particular, as it may not show up that way to certain people. It's interesting because red is often the warning color, right? And it's exactly the color that but some chunk of the population can't detect. Yes?
Yeah, I'm partly colorblind with
Okay.
Kind of meshes in with green and brown. It's not so much.
Okay, so it's not gray. Is that so?
Yeah.
Red would look brownish to you, or
It's not. I mean, I can still like see red, like I can tell that this is red. But sometimes if it's next to like a black background, or if it's next to another background of a higher intensity, it's hard to distinguish.
okay?
So it's kind of just blends in, not necessarily.
I got you. So your Coke bottle right there, is that
This is
it's
fine?
fine? Okay.
But sometimes
It's not so good. Okay, so a stop sign would actually, you would be able, okay.
Not
Gotcha.
too bad.
Okay.
I know that. I kind of understand.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Last thing about, no, so that's color. Next thing about presentations, motion and animation. Animation is incredibly powerful, okay? If I all of a sudden, you're going to probably have your eye follow me, okay? Because motion attracts the eye. There are theories about it. If you don't like evolution, just tune out for a moment, but okay, there's good reasons why the human eye tracks motion. If you think of the fact that it's generally agreed that our ancestors came off the savannah in Africa, what moves can kill you. What doesn't move can't. Okay? So your eye is going to be drawn to motion. Furthermore, if there are multiple things moving, your brain naturally cycles between the moving objects because any one of them could kill you. You need to keep track of all of them. So anytime you put multiple moving objects on a screen, the brain essentially cannot rest. You can try to force it to rest, but naturally the brain will cycle in a circle through all of the moving objects. What that means is it becomes very difficult to concentrate or get anything done because your brain keeps wanting to follow the moving objects. So animation is incredibly powerful at attracting attention, but it means that if you only need it to attract attention, you should probably only use it for a couple seconds and then you should pause the animation so the person can actually try to read or look at the picture and absorb the content. Because if it keeps flashing, it impedes the brain's ability to do anything. It also generally means you only want to have one animation running at a time. Now, it could be an integrated animation, but the idea is if you have two different animations on the screen, the brain's going to keep going back and forth between the two of them, and it's not really going to be able to focus on either one. So if you're using animations to present information to a user, you really only want one animation at a time, okay? Or if you have some kind of error condition, that's very good for using animation. Presumably there you do want to keep blinking until the person acknowledges it. Okay. Questions about that? Okay. Very quickly, color models, you should know what they are because there are three primary ones. The RGB model is the one used by computers. It's because it is a generative model. So it means it generates light. So that's the way the sun generates lights, is with red, greens, and blues. On your computer, your laptop, you have clusters of red, green, and blue phosphors. Basically, you have red, green, blue, red, green, blue. I know I'm only using blue. But each of the pixels on your screen is really three phosphors, essentially, unless they're LEDs. I understand LEDs now are changing, but in the past, they would basically point an electron beam at the phosphors. It would hit them, it would excite them, they would release a certain amount of energy. That would control the color that you see. LED lights do the same thing, they're just using some variation of that to emit color. Okay, and then, so that's how, it's a generative model, it's the primary colors, it's what's most often used in drawing packages. It's how color is expressed on the web. Okay? In HTML, you use the RGB model typically. The HSV model is the one we're used to as human beings. So we typically talk about hues like red, green, blue, orange, yellow. Okay? Then we talk about saturation, which is the pureness of the wavelength. The more saturated the wavelength, the purer the color. If there's a lot of white or gray mixed in, it is unsaturated. So the pastels are unsaturated. Okay, so unsaturated colors, the pastels, they are unsaturated. And finally, value is the intensity or brightness. Remember, that's what we really key on with the human ocular system. So HSV is the way we generally try to express color. Okay, it's not the one that's used, though, by professionals or computers, interestingly enough. So the CMY model is the one used by printers and artists. It is a reflective model because it reflects light. So the sun and a computer display generate light. The orange coming off of your shirt is reflected. Okay? So the CMY covers the reflective model, and each color, it stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and they are subtractive colors. They represent two colors combined with one color absent. So for example, cyan reflects the absence of red, magenta is the absence of green, and yellow is the absence of blue. So they're two colors mixed together in the CMY. And that's what artists use, that's what printers use as their model. Okay, so you should just know, if I were to ask you on a test, if you're presenting information to the user, you're probably using which model on a computer display? RGB is what you're using. Okay. Okay, and finally, when you're presenting text, this is good to know, both for presentations you make, if you're in 402 or any presentation. There are three types of general font families. Okay, my notes are in serif. They are fonts with curlies at the end of it, so you can see how this F has little curlies on it. And they are good for printed material because the stuff blends together. It helps the eye follow a line of text. Sans serif fonts are fonts that do not use curly decorations. So let's see, are they doing it? Yes. So here, this is a sans serif font. There's no curlies or footers on your individual characters. They make it much easier to read image or text on a computer display that has low res, like perhaps your smartphone. So you tend to use sans serif fonts on your computer presentation. So generally, if you were presenting text on a computer display, you generally should use a sans serif font like Helvetica, Arial, or Calibrate. Of course, I violated this in my own notes. Okay. And then finally, there are typewriter fonts. They're much less common than they used to be. The most obvious example is Courier. They are fixed width fonts. So sans serif and serif fonts are variable width fonts. Each character takes up a different width on the screen. Courier font or typewriter fonts, every character has the same width, and they're commonly used for doing code, presenting code. And of course, if you want another example, just look at my review guide that's using a typewriter font. You notice it just doesn't look as good, right? For whatever reason, typewriter font doesn't look as good, but you use it for programs, for presenting code. Okay, so again, that's good to know. In fact, of all the things that perhaps you might want to remember from today's talk, that perhaps is the most interesting because for presentations, you tend to want to use sans serif fonts. And I see a lot of students using serif fonts and it doesn't always work well. So, why did I go through all of that? is because I could have tried to show you 3 or 4 graphs or diagrams, but there's so many of them, it's more important that you just have some knowledge about the human visual system so that when you present information, you're somewhat knowledgeable in how you select your colors, how you use motion, how you select fonts, because that's going to be universal regardless of what graph or what diagrams you use. Okay, you're going to have to select colors and fonts. Okay, questions about that? We good? Okay. So, we pivot now. We've kind of given you the basics of information management, and we have 3 more lectures. We'll talk about HTML. The reason I chose HTML is it is so universally used with the web, which is an important source of information. I chose XML and JSON because they have become important ways of storing documents that are not stored in a database. Especially JSON has become a lot more important, so we'll talk about that. And finally, we'll talk about briefly databases, SQL and non-SQL databases, because databases are the third very important way to present information. So essentially, I tried to choose the 3 most important ways of representing information. The fourth, does anyone remember what is the most common way to represent information? But is spreadsheets. I'm just not going to talk about them. Okay, but spreadsheets, in fact, is perhaps the most important one. It's just they were designed specifically for non-programmers. We won't be talking about them. Now, in talking about HTML and JSON, I could try to choose a library. I won't. I will talk about it in effect at the assembly language level because as computer scientists, you should know what HTML looks like at the so-called assembly language level. You should be able to go into a document and edit it yourself if necessary. In fact, I have to do that with Canvas all the time because Canvas, if I try to do something on Canvas, I will show you. Let's say that I have a quiz, so let's go to quizzes. And I will edit. Okay, so I want to edit a question. And it gives me a nice little HTML editor, okay? Except, look at that. There's only certain things I can do. I can make things bold-faced. I can create a list. I can do a few other things, but let's say that I want to change the font. There's no way to change the font here. Okay? So they do give me a way to escape into an HTML where I have to do it by hand, but the only way I can do it is if I know the so-called HTML tags, the assembly language. So yes, there are HTML editors, but the problem is they often won't give you access to the full array of HTML that you might want to use. You should know what HTML looks like at, in effect, the assembly language level. Hence, that is what we will be talking about. Okay, so first thing, there is a difference. You'll hear HTML and CSS. HTML, hypertext markup language. CSS, cascading style sheets. HTML specifies the content and structure of web pages. Cascading style sheets specify the appearance of the web pages. So going back to here, you can see this was specifying what it looks like. I was using a so-called ordered list. This was a line item. This was the end of the line item. This was a line break. Okay, so very simple, and it ends up appearing looking like that, and the line break puts a blank line in there. Okay, So that specifies my content. But let's say I want it to jazz it up a little. Let's say, well, in fact, I can't do a color. So let's say I want this int x equals red to be, I wanted it to be I want it to be blue. So I could say span, and then I could say, let's actually put this out by itself, span style equals color blue. And now it's blue. Okay, this style was using CSS. Okay, it was specifying the appearance of the content. Okay, so between the two of them, you can specify the content and the structure of things. So I had a very quick, actually the easiest thing to do is look at my review notes right now. So there's a whole bunch of different HTML commands. So the first thing you need to know is an HTML document is roughly sure like to get another page here. Huh. There we go. This should give me another page, I hope. Something's broken. Okay. Okay. So, an HTML page starts with HTML tag. Then you have the so-called head part, and it is terminated. So all markup starts with less than and greater than tags. So that their tag, the way you distinguish a tag is they occur between less than and greater than signs. The way something ends is with a /. Then, so you have a body. That's the basic form of an HTML web page. This contains metadata. This contains the visible content. So anything in the head is not visible. Everything that appears in the head is directions to the browser about how to display the page, files to load, things that help a web crawler gather information about your page. Everything in the body is the visible content. Okay? And if you look at the HTML W3 schools that I had you look at today, they will tell you that every HTML document should begin with this doc type. I find I don't have to put that at the top of my HTML files, but it certainly does help if you want it to be kind of officially right, is you'd put this doc type, and you see there's a little bang sign there to help with that. Okay, so you could have doc type XML, doc type JSON, doc type text. There's a lot of different doc types you can have, and that helps the browser interpret what it's going to be displaying. Otherwise, the browser might be guessing at what it is displaying. So that first doc type helps the browser. Okay, it's essentially saying this is what the encoding for the rest of this document is. Okay, questions thus far? Okay, so basically HTML consists of tags, which is called the markup language, and you can have attributes associated with the tags. So for example, there is an image tag that says I want to display an image. Well, you need to specify a source file, so there's an attribute that gives the file name for that should be loaded in. There might be, say, alt equals, and this would be caption to display if image is unavailable.
And so there just needs to be white space there of some sort.
Yes. So basically, attributes are a name equals and then a character string. You just put spaces between them, white space. Okay, so the attributes basically are metadata that gives additional information to the browser about that tag. Pretty much all HTML tags have some attributes that you can associate with them. Okay, and you are allowed to nest tags within other tags. So for example, this head is nested within this HTML. So if you can actually parse any HTML document into a tree. Okay, so you can nest tags within tags. Again, every tag is generally terminated with a like tag, except it has a /. Okay? Questions about that? So then HTML makes a difference. It has essentially sections, blocks, which it often calls divisions, and it has inline content. Okay, so essentially you can think of a block as a paragraph. And you can think of inline content as something in a paragraph. So it uses so-called H1 through H6 tags to divide the document into sections. H1 stands for the primary header, H2 a secondary header. So for example, if I had here, you can see this is a heading. If I use H6, it will be a much smaller heading. Okay, so headers are specified with the H1 through H6 tags. Generally, you specify your blocks with a paragraph or with a div or with a block quote. Or with something called pre. Okay, and you can see the difference. So paragraphs and divs tend to be content that is not a paragraph, like maybe several paragraphs together. So they tend to be content that is perhaps even larger than a paragraph. You can see a quote, it does some special formatting with it. Pre, it is going to represent it with a typewriter font. It's generally used to represent code, even though there actually is now a markup tag called code. Okay, but before there was code, there was pre. Okay, so going back to here, you have p, div, block quote, pre as your blocks of content. Then if you want inline content, you'll use span and q. So you saw me use span already. Okay, so this is I use span, whoops. You saw me use span, so I might say span style equals, and that's where I said color blue. Okay, so it's in line with the paragraph. So it's something you do in a paragraph. Another thing might be I might underline stuff. Whoops. Maybe it's just you. That's right, that was an unordered list. Okay, so you underlines things. So there are things you can do. U underlines. T stands for teletype, so it'll look like typewriter font. Strong and B mean bold. EM and I means to italicize something. I should have put U here. It's not UL. U is underline. Anyone know what sub and sup stand for? Subscript and superscript. Okay, so inline ways to emphasize text. Okay, so that gives you basic text. Then BR gives you a way to break a line without creating a new paragraph. HR gives you a way to create a horizontal line. So if you've ever seen a horizontal line, there it is. Creates a horizontal line. And there are certain tags like HR and BR that don't contain content. So most tags contain content, but if a tag like HR or BR doesn't contain content, you don't have to terminate it. So here I just wrote HR. I didn't have to terminate it. Okay. Then, so that's basically your basic things for creating a document. But then there are certain things that you'd like to be able to do. And those might be, you might like to create a table. You might like to be able to create a link that someone can click on. You might like to be able to insert an image. You might like to be able to create a list. Okay, those are 4 basic things that you want to be able to do. And we have tags for all of them. In fact, table is table. Link starts with A. Image is IMG. And you can get unordered lists. You can get ordered lists. You can get some other types, but those are the 2 most common. This produces a bulleted list. This produces a numbered list. Okay. With links, you have an important attribute called href, which is the URL for the link. So you have to present a URL that you are going to jump to. Okay. And you then put content in there. So I might say, for example, href equals http web.eecs.utk bvz cs365, and then my content might be bvz's cs365 course. Okay, and if I display it, it comes up as a link. If I click on it, they've disabled it because they don't want to be going off to arbitrary places. Okay, but that creates a link. If you want to create an ordered list, you have to indicate what are the line items. So item 1, then item 2, item 3. Notice I am not terminating them with li. Technically that's wrong, but any browser will work properly. Yes. I have no idea. Well, no, there's actually, up in head, there is also a link tag. And if you want to include a CSS style sheet, so they use the link tag for something else. They use the link tag for metadata. So they had to come up with something else. And I don't know why they used A. I've never seen. But there is a link is a reserved keyword. Okay, so lists use li to indicate the different items of a list, and you can nest them. So okay, And of course, that doesn't look very good. Normally, you'd want A and B here. So there's a way with CSS to change that appearance. We'll get to that. Okay, so with cascading style sheets, you can change the default appearance of things. And finally, tables are the most complicated thing to create. So with a table, every table can start with a series of headers, right? So these are called TH tags. The header row is typically called, you specify with TH tags. You specify an entire row with the TR tag. So TR stands for table row. It creates a row of content. TD is a normal table cell. Why it's not, say, TC, I don't know, but TD creates an individual cell. And then there is a caption, which will create a caption tag which will create a caption. Of course, I did it badly. Caption will create a caption for the table. So, as an example, that's not what I wanted. Let's get rid of all this, and we'll create a table, TR, TH heading 1, TH heading 2, TR, TD, item 1, TD, item 2. Okay, and that is a table. And I'll even give it a caption. BBZ's fabulous table. I run it, and it doesn't look very good. But you can see the heading is in a different color than the items. And of course, it doesn't look anything like a table. Again, you would style it with CSS. Okay, so for example, just to show you, up here in the heading, I could create style, and I could say table, TD, TH should all have a border that is 1 pixel solid black. And it's not even showing it because I did something wrong. I forgot to terminate style, so it was a run-on. Still didn't like that table. Forgot to use commas. There we go. So now at least we got things around it, but it's annoying because you got double lines. So you could add then a border collapse property, collapse. And now it's down, it collapses them so you don't have multiple lines. You might think, well, that still kind of looks crowded. So I could add padding. And now I got padding. You'll see, notice by default the headings are centered and the items are left aligned. Maybe I want the items themselves to be aligned, so then I could say TD by itself, and I could say align center. Hope that works. Yeah, I think it might be text align. There we go. So you can see I can use CSS to style stuff and control how things get styled. So I can turn a table which by itself, so without all the style stuff, it looked pretty awful. But once I started to style it, it looked pretty neat. And believe me, you can waste a lot of time on this because it certainly does start to look even nicer and nicer. Like then I could say, wow, maybe I should make the heading TH. Let's change the background color, make it black. Okay, that worked, except now I have to make the color, say, yellow. See, it can be addictive. You can do all kinds of stuff. So those are the big four things that you can create with HTML. You can create tables, links, import images, which can be PDF, JPEGs, GIFs, all kinds of neat stuff. And then you can create lists. Okay? And probably there's a way to import video, except I didn't look it up before class. So I'm sure there's a way to import video. Okay. So for the test, you need to know all of this: table, image. I think I've gone through all the major tags. Okay. So any questions about how you create some content with HTML? You're going to do it for the homework assignment. What you're going to do is take one of my tests and format it with HTML just like I do. Yes?
So, but then is HTML possible?
This part is. Yes. So it's multiple choice. I expect you to be able to recognize this kind of stuff. Like if I say, which of the following tags is used to create blocks of content, then you can see p, div, block quote, and pre do that. So I'm not going to ask you to actually write out an HTML specification for the exam, but I expect you to know what the tags do. Okay, so I just went over them. Okay, so as I said, there are important attributes, but there are some attributes that are more important than others that you really need to know about. ID. ID uniquely identifies an element. So when you say PID equals BVZ, there should be no other tag named BVZ in your document. It's a promise that this uniquely identifies this tag. It makes it possible for a CSS selector to style that block. It makes it possible for JavaScript to identify that block and modify it if need be. The class attribute is used for styling purposes. So I might have class equals first paragraph. So a class is an attribute that is typically used by multiple tags that want to be styled in the same way. Yes, David?
Is there any way I can see the CSS you use? Because I noticed that's not in that directory, but you do have some somewhere.
Yes, and I think the answer is no. Okay, and the reason I think it's no is because it's made private. I'm happy to make it public. Okay, if you shoot me an email, I'll make it public. But normally anything that you're loading up is private for a reason, which is you don't want to kind of show everyone how you did it. But I don't care if you know how I did it. Okay, so ID and class are important. You see it a lot. Then there are certain attributes that are a little more specific. So I didn't show you this, but you can create forms in HTML, like radio buttons, menus, type in text boxes, and there's an attribute called name that is used to transmit form data to a server. Specifically, name is used as the key. So you often see name used a lot as an attribute, although only with HTML widgets. We talked about source. It pulls something into a document. For tables, you sometimes want to be able to have something span multiple columns. So for example, in my little thing here, let's say I wanted to have this, instead of the caption like I did here, let's just say I don't like the way it looks, so I want it as part of the table. So instead of making this a caption, what I'm going to do is make it be the first line, and now I want it to span the entire table, so I say column span equals 2, and now it spans the entire table. So the col span attribute is kind of nice for tables. Style. You saw me using that a lot to style elements. Despite my showing you how to do it, that is considered the wrong way to style your document. You're supposed to use style sheets. Okay? You're not supposed to style individual tags. The only exception is with images. With every image, you're supposed to provide a width and a height. So with an image, you will often see something like image style equals width, and you always have to specify it in pixels. You can't specify it in anything else, which is so annoying, because I often would like to specify it as a percentage, but you can't. So that says the image will be presented 500 pixels wide, 600 pixels high. And it prevents the page from flickering. Not only does it ensure that the image always appears in a certain size, but sometimes the page will flicker if you don't provide it as it loads, which can be bad. Okay, so that's the one time it's generally considered acceptable to use the style tag. But otherwise, you're generally not supposed to use it. So every tag has a lot of, not a lot, but most tags have some attributes associated with them, but these are the ones I expect you to know for the exam. Okay, you might like to be able to put comments into a file. In HTML, anything that starts with a less than, exclamation mark, dash dash is the start of a comment, and the comment ends with dash dash greater than. And that will not appear, the browser won't make that content visible. Okay, so that's how sometimes when I have solutions, I actually comment them out with these things so that you won't yet be able to see solutions, and then I remove the comment when I want you to see them. Now, sometimes on a web page you see cute things like pie or subset, or you see a with a couple dots above it. Is that an umla, or those of you who?
Yeah.
Umla. So they're characters you can't get from your keyboard. Okay, so how do you get them? You get them using something called HTML entity codes. And of course, I didn't show you right there what an HTML entity code looks like. They start with an ampersand, then it is the entity code, and then they end with a semicolon, so that's the delimiter. So for example, I did not get this less than by typing in less than. If you look at my page source, you will see that it's actually LT, which stands for less than. Greater than is ampersand GT, the entity code is GT. And for ampersand, it's AMP. Okay, so that's what got the ampersand. For pi, it was PI. And for the subset, it was ampersand sub. So you can look them up. If you do a Google search for HTML entity codes, you will find a whole set, so you can get all kinds of mathematical symbols. My guess is you could get Klingon if you want it. I don't know that for a fact, but I think you can. So you can get all kind of cool stuff by using these entity codes. Okay, so they start with an ampersand, then the entity, so this is the representation. Start with an entity code, ampersand, then the entity code, then a semicolon. They also typically, if you do a Google search, they also have numbers, but almost no one ever uses the numbers. Even though I couldn't get it right. So they also come with numbers, like then they start with a pound sign. Unless you do this all the time, I can't imagine that you would remember what the numbers meant. Okay, I just remember what the abbreviations mean. Okay, so questions about any of that? Okay, so now you can style and profile. No, you can't profile or style. Okay, so now we want to be able to present, and now CSS, you are not going to be responsible for CSS, but I'm actually splitting days, so you need to know a little bit about CSS today. So we will talk about that. No, but part of it's on today's quiz, I think. Okay, so you will, with style sheets, you kind of already saw me using them. So they start with a selector. So that is what P is. It's a selector. In this case, it's a tag saying all paragraphs, and then you use a block. And the block is one or more property value pairs. So these are obvious properties are obviously defined by CSS, and these are predefined values. Okay? You can also use HGB to create your own specific colors. In fact, there's a whole bunch of color models. I won't go into them. I think it supports, HTML supports RGB. I think it supports HSV. So however you want to specify a color, it has predefined colors, which I'm using here. It allows you to create your own colors using RGB or HSV models. Okay, and I'm making the font size be 16 pixels. Normally, you can use pixels. Depending on the type of property, you can use pixels, you can use inches, you can use percentages, depending on what's going on. You can also use sometimes M. Does anyone, I think EM, which is a kind of typographic thing. I never use it. Sometimes you can also use point for point size. Depends on the type of the thing. Okay, so selectors and then blocks. Okay, pretty simple. And there's three ways you can specify a style. You can use a style sheet. So you often see files that are x.css. Those are style sheets. At the top of your, so that's one. You can also at the top of your document in the head statement, you can put style comments, and often you do that when you are starting to develop a new set of styles and experiment with them. Once you have it working, you then move it out into a style sheet. And you've seen the third way, which is with the style inline style tag, which is generally frowned on. So those are three ways to specify it. They are increasingly specific. So typically, this would override your styles that are done in the document, which in turn would typically override whatever was imported in the style sheet. Okay? So if you had P color red, but then you had P style equals color blue, that particular paragraph would appear in blue because, whoops, that should not have been. This paragraph would appear in blue because this style attribute is more specific. So they are, in some sense, prioritized. Okay? So that's just what I said there. You can have an internal style sheet, an external style sheet. The way that you import a style sheet is in the head statement. Remember you asked about link? So this is saying that you are importing a style sheet. REL indicates the type of the link. Then type tells the browser that this is CSS in the text format. And then href is the URL that it is using. It can either be an absolute address or a relative address. So this starts in the current directory at the CSS, assumes there's a CSS subdirectory. Okay, then the types of selectors. They are pretty numerous, but the most common types are the three you see here. So tags, so like P, TD, table, and you can have comma-separated lists. So you saw me write table, TH, TD. That meant it applied to all three of the tags. Okay, remember I said that you could have something like P class equals first para. And then if you want to select that for styling purposes, you would say dot first para. So the dot indicates a class selector. If you're trying to select so if I also had said ID equals BVZ, the way you select an ID is with a hashtag and then the name of the ID. So that would specifically select that particular tag for styling purposes. Okay? So those are the three most common ways. Then you sometimes want to specify, let's say that in a nested ordered list, I want to use, remember that, notice here I have 1, then I have A, then I have I. If you looked at my style sheet, you would see that I had OLOL. So anytime an ordered list is nested inside of an ordered list, I have list style type lower alpha. So it produces a lowercase alphabetical character. And then I have another one, OLOLOL, for triply nested, and its list style type is lower Roman. So you can use, this was not comma separated. So it's saying that it matches the last tag. So if you have in effect, nested tags, it has to specifically match this. Now, I could have OL line item P dot 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 P OL, and this will still match this OL. It doesn't have to be direct tags. Okay? So it would still match. And then I will not test you. So this is the finish of what I will test you on. Okay? These three kinds of selectors. But you should know that there are so-called pseudo-classes that allow you to predefine classes because they come up so often. So for example, with links, you may have not yet visited a link, or you may already have visited it. So you'll notice that in my stuff, if I have visited something, it is one color. I've visited everything here. So it's all in a certain color. But notice here I haven't visited this one yet, so it's in a bright blue. So you might want to color things differently depending on whether you've already visited or not. Or if it's active, meaning you've clicked on it, pushed down, you may want a different color. So when I click on something, it turns red it's just instantaneously, notice it turned red, meaning it was active. Okay? Or let's say you want the first letter of something. So the first letter of a paragraph or the first line of something. Okay? Or you want to put something like an image, you want to force it before something, like in LaTeX, sometimes you want to force an image before a block. You can do that with a pseudo class. Again, I won't test you on any of this, you just should know. Or I want the first child, like the first paragraph within a div. So I might say div first child, so that the first tag is styled differently. This is cute for tables because sometimes in tables you want either your rows or columns formatted differently. So that actually allows you to select like odd children or even rows and color them differently in a table. So for example, do I have an example? There we go. You put it in parentheses. So I might say nth child, I know I said nth of type here, but nth child odd, and then if that was TD, it would make every odd column be gray. Similarly, if I did it for TR, every odd row would be gray. So there's all these so-called pseudo classes that allow you to, they're basically classes that come up so frequently we don't want to have to force the user to define their own classes. Okay, so we'll talk about the cascade next time, but why they're called cascading style sheets. But any questions about selectors? Again, what I'll hold you responsible for are tags, classes, IDs, and nested selectors. Things like OL. Okay? So, have a good weekend. Do a little studying. It'll be easy because the weather forecast stinks. Okay, we're supposed to have rain through Sunday. So, at any rate, I will see you on Tuesday, hopefully bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And remember, get the homework assignment done tonight because there's no late submissions.
Did you say nested selectors or something?
So, what I meant, just a sec.